Well, it's no secret that the post, I think, that blew this channel up was one that I did recently on 5 picks for big rock albums from 1967. And while many of the people who commented on it agreed with those, there were a lot of people who had a lot of honorable mention titles. And maybe this is the first of many videos I'll do because of the response to that particular video on that I entitled the 5 most perfect albums, rock albums in 1967. Well, a lot of you chimed in with that and had a lot more, many other perfect responses in terms of what you thought I should include and that kind of thing. And you know what? I think I will make it a goal to get to every one of those, but I wanted to do another video on maybe the first of a lot of honorable mentions. Now, I thought about doing 10 albums, but I think 5 is manageable because I had to go back and listen to 3 of these albums that I'll talk about on this video, honorable mention titles, rock titles from 1967. I guess I could call this video 5 more perfect albums from 1967. So here are 5 more perfect albums, that 3 of which I listened to last week to kind of get a refresher, and 2 that I'm fairly familiar with because I listen to them on a regular basis. So, let's get right into it. 1967 is one of the most influential album years ever. And I think a lot of you totally agree with that sentiment, judging by the response to that video. And during 1967, some of the highest regarded and timeless music ever produced and released, as well as some of the outer limits of the rock and roll universe, were pushed into rich and just entertaining fusions of genres and frontiers of technology. 1967 just, represented this exponential leap into experimentation in what music could definitely become that was truly ahead of its time, at the same time being very accessible to the vast majority of people who listened to popular music that year. So just a perfect storm of all of these elements led to one of the biggest years for influential albums ever. So in this particular show, I wanted to discuss 5 other albums that, could have gone in the first episode that I did, perfect albums. You can call these honorable mentions, but at this point, these are just 5 more perfect albums, right? So 2 of them are by The Doors. First 2 albums, actually, and we'll get to that in a second. And here they are in no particular order. And when I get done with each of them, I'll just talk about the rating I would give to each of these albums. And I would say that no album that I talk about got below an 8 out of 10, according to my highly scientific rating. So an album that came up many times in the comments to the other video was the album Disraeli Gears by Cream. If Fresh Cream introduced the world to the trio's raw blues power, Disraeli Gears, I think, refined it into something much wilder and more kaleidoscopic. And it was released at the tail end of the year, almost November of 1967. And this was the second album by the band. And I would say this is a band that produced a psychedelic masterpiece here, befitting of the album art of the album here. And I think it balanced, really a virtuoso touch with a genuine pop sensibility. And they really pulled it off. It's just a really interesting trick that Cream really pulled off and made this album totally accessible. And I have to say, yes, I'm a little ashamed I didn't put it on that first episode, but better late than never, right? And Strange Brew, the opener of the album, very compact, blues, wrapped in just a really cool production. And from there, the record barely pauses for breath. I mean, it just one track flows into another effortlessly. Of course, Sunshine of Your Love remains one of rock's most instantly recognizable riffs. The bass line of Jack Bruce and Eric Clapton's guitar are just locked together in something that feels both primal and futuristic. Just 2 thumbs up. The drums of Ginger Baker, characteristically volcanic, would be a way I would describe that. And it serves the songs, I think, rather than overwhelming or overpowering the songs. It's just a perfect complement to vocals. Now, what I think separates this album, Disraeli Gears, from much of its psychedelic contemporaries is it actually is a pretty warm album. It's warmth. Pete Brown, the lyricist, working with Jack Bruce on this album, kind of gives this playful, surrealistic aspect to tracks like Tales of Brave Ulysses, for example, and it doesn't feel pretentious. Again, all of this is included in the album's cover art, that whole spirit, that day glow pink and floral excess that really mirrors the music inside. Clapton's guitar tone is the stuff of legend on this album, as far as I'm concerned. And he worked with a Gibson Les Paul on this. He achieved, I think, a sustained sound on this album that would influence rock guitarists for decades. I think that's how influential his riffs were on this album. And yet, he plays with this economy, letting the songs breathe on this album. And I think you really would agree with that. The album is quite dazzling, and I think this album, Disraeli Gears, captures Cream at a definite creative peak, producing music that genuinely felt new, dare I say avant-garde, and more than, 5+ decades, it still does. It's just a great album. I give this album a 9.2 out of 10. Now, of course, that was an album I had to listen to because, again, I do listen to it on a fairly regular basis, along with the next two albums, both by The Doors, their first and second albums released in 1967. Of course, let's talk about their debut. I think few debut albums announce a band's arrival with such unsettling confidence. And this album was released quite fittingly at the beginning of the year in January of 1967. The self-titled debut by The Doors is a record I think that feels less like an introduction and more like a fully formed worldview. It's sensual, it's dark, and it's shot through with a lot of literary ambition. Of course, Jim Morrison's voice is the obvious focal point here, a baritone that slides effortlessly between a whisper and a roar, a theatrical roar. From the opening notes of Break On Through to the Other Side, there is an urgency that I think feels genuinely dangerous on the album, genuinely performative on this album, and the album just feels like a seance. That's what it reminds me of. And believe it or not, what I think makes this album extraordinary, though, is how perfectly the other three members of the band share the same vision as Morrison did. The organ that Ray Manzarek played, I think, carries the melodic weight of the album that you could fill with, say, another instrument like a bass guitar, and it really wouldn't have the same effect. And I think that gives a song kind of an eerie yet carnival-like undercurrent, which makes the tracks compelling. The guitar of Robbie Krieger on this album is fluid, it's blues-filled, and it anchors the more, say, psychedelic passages to something more earthy. And, of course, the drumming of John Dinsmore is restrained, yet there's a huge range to that percussion there. But I would have to say that the centerpiece of the album, and I'm sure many of you will agree with me, is the track The End. At over 11 minutes, it's really an odyssey that has no business working as well as it does. 11 minutes is long enough, but here, it's just completely mesmerizing. And the bluesy kind of tinge of the track Backdoor Man, and of course the pop perfection of Light My Fire, just really demonstrate a band with astonishing range on this album. And if I had to say that there's a weakness of the album, it's really not a weakness, but I'll just kind of say it. The sheer intensity of this whole album can be really exhausting. That's if you go into listening to it with the intent of reviewing it, because you're like, what more can I say about the cohesiveness of this debut album? This is not background music, and it's music that deserves full attention. And I guess that's why I would say it could be really exhausting to reviewers who are very earnestly trying to describe it, especially for somebody who's never heard it. And that's the greatest strength of this album. I think it remains one of the most immersive debuts of albums released between 1966 and, say, 73 in terms of classic rock. And it's just a record that sounds like nothing else. I give it a 9.5 out of 10, the highest ranking I give out of any album on this list. And since we're on The Doors, we'll go to their follow-up, Strange Days. Now, released just 8.5 months after their remarkable debut, Strange Days by The Doors is a record that doubles down on everything that made their first album so compelling. And then it pushes, I think, steps further into the dark. It's more unsettling, I think, and in many ways, I think a more accomplished album than its predecessor, even if it has never quite received, I think, the same recognition. The title track, Strange Days, I think it belies kind of a dark atmosphere with a carnival-type aura about it. Of course, Manzarek's keyboards here kind of buttress Jim Morrison's proclamations like something from a fever dream on this album. This sets the tone rather perfectly, I think, and this is an album I think that is less interested in breaking through than, what lies on the other end of the wall you're trying to break through. I think that Jim Morrison's lyrics on this album reach new heights of ambition on this album. The track People Are Strange is deceptively a simple track, 2 minutes. And it manages, I think, to capture alienation with ease in only, a little over 2 minutes there. Another good track, Moonlight Drive, is one of the first songs that Morrison pitched to Ray Manzarek, and it gets its recorded moment here on this album, and I think it really delivers on its promise. Hypnotic, yet languid, so a good listen there. The songwriting of Krieger here on this album, it's just invaluable. The track Your Lost Little Girl is equal parts tender and little sinister, and the track Love Me Two Times provides pretty much straight ahead rock. Doesn't feel out of place on the album. I consider the centerpiece of the album a track called When the Music's Over, and I think it rivals The End from the debut as being, just as good an extended composition as that last track. And at not as long, but a little bit under 11 minutes, it as the end, it builds from like a quiet introspection to a near apocalyptic intensity. And Morrison's eventual rallying cry, decades ahead of its time, and I think captured by, the late Val Kilmer in the biopic there, sits alongside, I think, passages of genuine musical transcendence. And I think that this album really easily stands alongside their debut. I would give it an 8.9 out of 10. Okay, this next one I had to listen to again while preparing for this particular episode, and I'm glad I did, because I really haven't heard it in about 2 or 3 years. Many people talked about this album not being on the first video I did about 1967, but The Who Sell Out. By late 1967, concept albums in a span of, say, 12 months were, dare I say, becoming fashionable. The Beatles had Sgt. Pepper, the Moody Blues, which I'll talk about next, had Days of Future Past, and The Who characteristically decided to do something simultaneously smarter and sillier than either. The Who Sell Out frames its songs kind of as a pirate radio broadcast on this album, with jingles, fake advertisements, continuity announcements that link the tracks on the album. I think one of rock's greatest conceptual jokes, you could say, but they employ it rather masterfully on this album. And what makes this work is that the songs underneath are really just really great songs. Pete Townsend, I think, was at a creative peak. He wrote with a lot of confidence and emotional directness, and the lead single of the album, I Can See for Miles, is a really towering achievement, built on a really cool guitar riff and propelled by Keith Moon's drumming. Just incredible. And I think it's really up there in one of the band's finest, I would say, top 3 moments, perhaps. Of course, the fake advertisements that link the songs are funnier than they have any right to be. Roger Daltrey bathing in baked beans for Heinz, for example. Townsend, of course, applying a big roll-on deodorant stick. The accompanying artwork really sold the album too. I mean, that can't be understated. Yet the satire on this album has a genuine bite, and the album skewers commercialism while simultaneously embracing that. It's like a paradox The Who seemed really comfortable inhabiting. John Entwistle's bass here is remarkable, of course, very distinctive, fluid, melodic. The track Silas Stingy on the album showcases his songwriting that fits perfectly, I think, on the album. I do think the album loses its slight momentum in the final third, and the transitions between the songs feel a little bit abrupt rather than seamlessly broadcast-like, but it still works. This is a small complaint because The Who Sell Out is a smart, funny, inventive, musically thrilling record, in my opinion, that wears its ambitions on its sleeve for all to see and enjoy. I give it an 8 out of 10. Finally, the Moody Blues has promised Days of Future Past. Few albums in rock history represent, I think, as dramatic a reinvention as Days of Future Past. Now, this record was originally conceived as a Decca Records showcase for their new electronic stereo system, using Dvorak's New World Symphony as source material. The project was hijacked by the Moody Blues into something more altogether personal and ambitious. And I think the result is one of 1967's more audacious releases. Now, the concept of this album is rather simple. A single day from dawn to midnight, narrated in verse by the drummer Graham Edge and scored with kind of a lush orchestral arrangement by Peter Knight. What I think could have been a simple gimmick instead becomes the album's greatest strength, giving the record kind of a cohesion and emotional arc that few rock albums of the era could really claim or even conceive. Justin Hayward's contributions, of course, are, I think, at the heart of this album. Nights in White Satin, written when he was just 19, remains a stunning achievement, 60 years later. It's kind of a meditation on longing, and it's, buttressed by Peter Knight's sweeping string arrangements. And it shouldn't work as well as it does, but it does. And it's genuinely moving. The track Tuesday Afternoon, for example, is equally gorgeous, drifting, very delicate vocals by Justin Hayward, and the integration of the London Festival Orchestra is handled, I think, very gracefully. And it doesn't dwarf the band. It allows the band to feel complementary to the orchestral elements, I think. I would call it kind of a dialogue rather than a collision, I suppose. It'd be a good way to describe it. Some people say this album tips toward pretension. I think that's kind of a low-hanging fruit. I think it truly is an experiment that really works on so many levels. And I think this is an album, Days of Future Past, that invented a genre, launched a career, of course, the band, and still sounds remarkably poised in 2026. I give it a solid 8.5 out of 10. So there you have it. At least for now, 1967. You guys can tell me how you feel about it. These are great albums that, of course, I guess I could have considered it in my first video on rock albums in 1967. Nothing is perfect, but I would, again, I'll title this video 5 More Perfect Albums from 1967. And you can kind of tell me how you feel about it, the reviews, and if you agree with my takes on them. But these are great albums. And if I had to say, again, every year that passes, the Doors albums, you just listen to them and you can just keep listening to them forever. They're that good. The Doors, the 2 top albums, I think, in this show here. These are 5 great albums. If I had to say the weakest, and again, that's very subjective, would be the Who album, but that album is still a great album. And out of all the comments that I read on my previous video, it was the one that was mentioned the least, but still many people felt that it should have been included as well. So I did, and I hope you kind of agree with that review. So let me know what you think. I probably will continue to do 67 albums, but maybe just 1 album per show, going a little bit deeper, maybe in the form of my Listening Room podcast, which I urge you to take a listen to. The first episode is already up, Stevie Wonder episode regarding his 1985 album In Square Circle, and whether it was a detriment to his career, a footnote to his career, or just an extension of somebody whose greatness was still evolving by the mid-1980s. I'm Michael Douglas, and I'll see you next time.